So we have two presentations. Patrick Deegan from the Institute of Data-Driven Design, CTO of Open Mustard Seed, which hopefully you guys have all heard about. Primavera Di Filippi from the Berkman Law Center at Harvard. The Berkman Center for Internet and Society. I got it right. John Light, who I've just met. John, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I work with a nonprofit called the OK Turtles Foundation, and we're using blockchain technology to solve identity and internet security problems.
And Steve Waldman. Steve is an economist. Is that fair?
Yeah.
He writes a blog called Interfluidity, which has been cited by Krugman a fair number of times. And he's also a very talented Scala developer. And let's begin with Patrick's presentation.
Okay, so I'm going to start with a little motivation behind identity for us. Let's say in the early days, we didn't have much use for distributed consensus algorithms. The like buttons were large mechanical switches, and it's likely that the person you were going to like was in the room with you already. Then fast forward to 8 to 10 years ago, and we now have massively distributed embedded systems. Here's a robot on the right. I built it that is a small humanoid. It's balancing like a Segway. It has a vestibular system. It has low-level reflexes. Upon that is sort of a spinal cord, prevents the robot from falling. And when it does, it can go into, take actions to correct its posture. And it's relatively safe around humans. Here some children are actually having a telepresence experience through it where a remote child is essentially Skyping through, and whatever motions the child makes, the robot makes. And so we can start to think about doing like taking Second Life further and going into Third Life. So we've got robots coming in, scanning 3D environments and interacting with people, while also projecting game characters and other sorts of environments into the real world and vice versa. So I think that's really interesting, but as we've been talking a little bit already today about Sybil attacks, I think the problem of ghost in the machine in this case is really critical, something we absolutely have to solve. It's one thing to say my private keys were compromised and I lost some Bitcoin, here's some value that is now just vanished into thin air. But what if we actually have physical systems in the real world where we have life support systems, health care of elderly, and digital and physical assets that are critically at stake if we don't get this infrastructure right. So one thing that I'm sort of thinking about is, can blockchain be the DNA of our digital identities? So how did natural systems sort of form to cope with cell differentiation, immune system, growth limits? How did my finger know exactly where to stop in terms of growing? What sort of systems have priority over others, and what is just overall value and coordination of a system as complex as, say, a human body? And so I think if we look at it that way, the blockchain serves as this role of massively coordinating very disparate and decentralized systems, and sort of gives us hope that we'll be able to build machines going forward that afford us the level of security we should expect, while also giving sort of a strong sense of identity. So to understand where to go from here, let's, I guess, look at where we've been. I'll make the claim that sort of information systems go through a series of cycles through, as we are achieving exponential growth. First, we were centralized, but then we found, physical resource constraints required we decentralized, but then networks formed so that we could start sharing data and connecting with others. But now that we're distributed, we essentially find ourselves close to the present day where we've centralized a lot of things into certificate authorities. We're social media in order to discover and find other people, other assets. We've gone back to this sort of centralized model. Now we have these large data silos that basically control the networks of data exchange. Well, Bitcoin comes along and gives us this opportunity to, I think, decentralize things. So now I think we're in a place of sort of expansion and moving more towards an overall decentralized intelligence. And I think in that there's going to be a massive new number of connections. Just the network effect means, I think, we're not only channeling an exponential growth in the amount of information we create, but it seems like the connections and the ways that we can leverage that are just massively increasing. So getting into sort of details about how we want to address identity here, the idea is that we can employ a self-sovereign identity and a user-centric control of personal data. In doing so, we enable a transparent enforcement and effective life governance. This you may have heard of before in terms of this Windhover principles. So these were some guiding notions that we've taken on in trying to develop an open source platform to allow people to centralize the control over their personal data, monetize it, and then participate in markets and exchanges, potentially not just with other humans, but also with machines. So how do we establish identity in this framework? Well, the idea is that with our mobile phones, with our personal robots, we're now collecting an enormous amount of data that can actually be used to validate and verify certain attributes of our identity. For instance, the GPS data on my mobile phone collected over a few weeks is going to be able to give an algorithm enough that it could actually, determine my home and work address to a pretty high level of confidence. So why not actually entrust decentralized systems like smart contracts to perform this kind of analysis and then essentially digitally sign these attributes and allow others to independently verify that not only was this data collected from my mobile phone, but it's associated with me, it's most likely my home and work address, and I think we can go building from that point and take it a lot further. Then we start to introduce validation from social graphs, so all sorts of things coming in from social media. This just becomes a great opportunity to sort of decentralize the concept of attributes for an identity. And so then what do we have with that? We've got this ability to do personas, so I could have multiple personas. Here's maybe a pseudonym Family Guy. I'm also Back to the Future. But for instance, on the left there, I have my location hidden, but it's also verified. So how do we create situations like for a transaction, I don't necessarily need to give up any personal identifiable information, but maybe if I had some sort of escrow or some sort of independent system that was able to hold and cache this data for me and also guarantee that it's verified, then other people can trust me without needing to necessarily give up my anonymity. And so just last slide here, one of the concepts that we've trialed has to do with, let's say if Alice and Bob here on the bottom are entering some kind of transaction, we've got a sender and receiver. They're both authenticated by what we call the root identity service into, you see those private TCCs, those are basically virtualized web services where they've collected the personal data from their mobile phones, so maybe gigabytes of GPS data, can then interact with this attribute authority TCC. Let's say there's not a user which controls that virtual resource, but actually a smart contract. And now that smart contract is ensuring that some sort of algorithm, which is now analyzing my GPS points, concludes that I have a home and work address and can then store that in the group TCC. Now, group TCC doesn't have to have any of the raw data in it at all, but it has these verified attributes. And using a smart contract again here, we can enable access control to that data so that third parties such as compliance or enforcement can access that data, make sure that auditing compliance policies were all enforced globally, and that if there's any dispute mediation or remediation, anything that needs to happen between Alice and Bob, that can also be enforced according to sort of opt-in agreements that they may have went into upon initially joining the network in the first place. So that's all I wanted to show today.
So, so I'm working on this European project, and the idea is, so the basic idea is we are trying to figure out alternative metrics in order to evaluate the contribution that people are doing in common-based peer production communities. So essentially, can we try and identify a system that is not based on the traditional market mechanism in order to understand and compare different contribution and basically the value produced by the different contributors to those communities. So it's some kind of reputation-based system, but it's not the traditional sense of reputation, which tries to understand what kind of person or what is the identity of the person we're interacting with, but is more based on understanding the types and the value of the contribution that has been done by those individuals. So the basic idea is that we have, so this is something that we designed for the common-based peer production, which is basically Wikipedia, Creative Commons, so those things that do not actually rely on traditional monetary metrics. Ideally, it will be a system that can apply to generally anything, but it makes sense to try it on this particular platform because this is actually, those are communities that actually cannot rely on the traditional market metrics, right? So the idea is, first of all, it's based on 3 layers. The first layer is we need to identify what is the systemic value of the different communities that belong to a particular ecosystem. So if we take like a really simple example with just those 4 entities, the idea is to use some kind of algorithm which would be a mixture between Flutter and the one kind of like PageRank mechanism. So every institution that belongs to the ecosystem is given basically a weight or like a budget, but it's not a budget, of like 1, and they can fraction this and they can assign it to the other communities within the same ecosystem according to how they consider to be the weight of those communities, or whether, for instance, if they feel that they are dependent. So for instance, Wikipedia is highly dependent on the work done by Creative Commons because they need them in order to release the content. So anyway, so the idea is that every community will evaluate its own interrelationship with the other communities, and by circularity over time we get some kind of like equilibrium where we can understand the relative value of every communities within the ecosystem, more or less. Then the second layer is then you have the individual that contribute to those communities. And so in this case, the idea is that we're trying to figure out how we can design a common denominator of value, but something like the price system, which is essentially looking at so it doesn't look at like what is the inherent way in which an object or a good has been created, but just look at the ultimate interaction between the market players, how they actually want to purchase or how they want to sell the goods. And according to the meeting of those things, then we can identify a price, which then can be used to compare the value and to evaluate the market value of a good. So what we are trying to do with this system is we want to rely on this concept of like systemic value or social value. And so the idea will be that whenever people contribute to one of those particular communities, they get gratification. So it's based on like gratitude or like appreciation. So as, for instance, as someone contributes to Wikipedia, Wikipedia will provide some kind of, so it's not a token because it's not transferable, but like some kind of indication of gratitude for the particular contributor. And so this is a way, either it can be like made ex post, which means that people are contributing to Wikipedia and then the Wikipedia community will determine that this was actually a contribution that is highly valuable and therefore will gratify the people. Or it can be done ex ante, so Wikipedia realized that there is like particular articles that need work or that they want to incentivize contribution on that particular article, and so they can create some kind of bounty and say whoever is going to contribute to this, assuming quality and whatever, then they will be given a particular amount of token, which are not token. And then, so this apply for like all the different communities, but then the problem is that every contributor will be collecting those tokens, but there is no way to compare or to translate the value of one token within one community with the value of another token in a different community. So by relying on the first layer, where we actually identify the relative value of the different communities between each other, we can normalize the value of every token that are distributed by the community by basically taking the number. So Wikipedia is completely free to decide how many tokens to issue, right? And ideally, as more people contribute to Wikipedia, then Wikipedia will decide to issue more tokens in order to reward the new contributors. But because the people contributing to Wikipedia will increase the overall social value of Wikipedia, normally there should be some kind of like stability, but it doesn't have to be. So Wikipedia can decide, for instance, to create inflation and to provide much more token than the growth of their social value, and this is like up to the community to decide how to govern this. And so the idea is, if we take every community and we can normalize the value of the token by subdividing the systemic value of the community by the number of tokens that are distributed, then the individuals which are collecting those tokens, they have some kind of portfolio. And this portfolio contains, for instance, 10 Wikipedia token and 5 Creative Commons token, which when they are normalized creates like one numeric value, which to some extent can be taken to correspond to the overall value that this person has contributed to the overall ecosystem as a whole. And then the idea is like people collect those things, and the idea is that then people can apply a specific matrix on those portfolios, right? So for instance, this is a really stupid example with McDonald's, but if we take the example of a university, so for instance, a university might be interested in the people that have been contributing to Wikipedia more so than the people that have been contributing to couchsurfing or something else. And so by looking at the portfolio of the people, they can apply a matrix and modify the value that were evaluated at the layer 1, which was the neutral, the systemic evaluation, in order to understand, for instance, what is the value of one person for a particular field, so for the academic field or for the open source field or whatever. And by modifying the value of the overall contribution, they can decide how to act upon it. So in this way, the idea, because this is based for the common base production, is that this would allow for market actors or for like academia or for like whatever public authorities or whatnot to look at the contribution of the person without really caring about who is the actual identity or whatnot, but just looking at how the person has been behaving and how the contribution has been evaluated by the community itself in order to act upon it. So in order to provide privilege or whatever. But so this is one way for people that contribute to the common base ecosystem to have a choice, or to be able to have like a hybrid model. Either they decide to actually go into the traditional market model and actually get paid for their work, or they can contribute to the common, knowing that there are a few actors, and ideally, if this system is actually adopted by more and more people, then maybe more and more actors will actually take this to reward them or to appreciate their contribution to the commons. And the idea is, so we want to implement it on some kind of Ethereum-like platform, because this will just completely make it extremely much easier to implement. But this is something that is just, the idea is basically platform neutral. I think that's it.
Maybe if there are quick questions for Patrick or Primavera before we form.
I have a quick question for Primavera. So there's this thing called LZB coin, that's like the coin, and the idea with that is, hey, we'll give coins out to people who make comments on articles or whatever. It sounded cool in theory, but what it's done in practice is just incentivize a lot of spam and people just trying to get coins. We see this with Reddit, people tipping and this, making sock puppets do that. How do you prevent that from happening, or how can you ameliorate that from?
So I mean, this is a work in progress, so I don't have a perfect answer because we're still figuring out. There is two solutions that we had in mind. One is that, in fact, it is, so we focus on the community, right? So it's not that the community will say, I mean, the community can decide to say whatever they want, but if they notice, if they say, for instance, whoever writes an article will get like 1 coin, and then they notice that people are just like spamming, then they will change the algorithm, because the community has the power to decide exactly how to do. So probably probably it's gonna be like maybe quantitative and qualitative, or you can make the algorithm just as you want. So it's kind of, it's up to the community to decide what's the best system, and they can experiment and change it over time. An alternative model, which we are trying to experiment now, but it's really prototypical, is the idea that the problem of like, it's kind of like a cheating answer, in the sense that it's really complex, and oftentimes for those communities which are actually decentralized communities, it's really hard to come to like an agreement of who, like, first of all, what is the rule that the community consensually agree to? Second, which one are the people that are entitled to qualify and to evaluate, etc. So it creates like a lot of complexity, which perhaps the community doesn't even want to deal with. So an alternative model that we came up with will be to actually rely on the individuals of the community. So for instance, Wikipedia has this system of like tanks, or Yelp, you can also like rate the rating and things like this. And the idea will be that individuals are assigned two types of reputation. One reputation, which is basically the reputation related to their own contribution. So the more people, thanks or whatever, appreciate my contribution, then the more my contributor reputation grows. And on the other hand, to also assign to every person evaluator reputation, which means that, if I just click like to everyone, then I'm a really bad evaluator, because I'm just spamming the evaluation. Or if I like things that no one else like, maybe I'm also not a good evaluator. Whereas if I like things that maybe are not extremely popular yet, but that will become popular, then this is going to make my evaluator reputation grow. And then by transitivity, when a person with a high evaluator reputation like something, then it transitively provide more value than if it's someone with a really low evaluator reputation. So the idea is to implement this dual system of reputation, so in order to try and resolve those problems, which might not be perfect, because then I guess, so the first one is kind of, I think, more protected against Sibyl attack because it's based on the community itself. When we actually move back to the individual assessing other individual, then I think there is this higher risk of Sibyl attack. So it's a trade-off that I don't know exactly the best solution for that, but I'm happy to discuss it.
If there's one more, maybe for Patrick, otherwise we'll...
On your first slide you had with this first layer where there's four companies, but communities were. So, yeah, could you take this, or why would you take it on this community level? Could you not take it on a personal level, where you just say, okay, this person contributes, or is for me kind of valuable, or I know him, or...
So, I don't know if you've read the book from Cory Doctorow, In and Out from the Magic Kingdom. So I actually had not read it, but when I started working on this, everyone told me to read it, so I finally read it. And it basically presents how terrible of a world it will be, where you have a system of individual ranking other individual for every one-to-one interaction, because whenever I interact with you on a way that, I'm just talking to you, I'm gonna think, how are you gonna rate me, and things like this. So the fact of relying on the community is kind of like a protection, so that people can still interact as people. And it's because the idea of this system is really, we don't care, you can be like, I don't know, like a really mean person, but you can still be a really great contributors, And this system is not meant to assess you whether you're good or bad. It's just meant to evaluate the quality and the appreciation given to your contribution by the community. So it kind of makes sense to rely on the community as a community as opposed to individual. Because if you rely individually, it will be just my subjective assessment of you, but it doesn't tell anything about the contribution,
Yeah, so I have a sort of ill-formed question for the panel. I often think about the world kind of like in terms of the PageRank algorithm. I think it's an academic bias, I guess. Citation graphs are sort of very informative historically and give a sort of notion of reputation that you guys have sort of both alluded to. Can we talk a little bit more about that? And can we also talk about, I guess, attempts to game it and their effect on these sort of social metric-based systems? Anybody?
I would like to talk about So I'm going to evade the question a little bit because
That's fine.
I don't have so much to say about the social graph part, but I wasn't even quite sure when I came here exactly what I would say, but the conference has been great, and I know exactly what I want to say, so I'm going to sort of cheat. But it's going to be all about gaming. So I loved Vlad Zemfir's initial presentation. I thought it set things up really well, and it's cryptoeconomics. Is it cryptography for economists or economics for cryptographers? And of course the answer is both, but the weak link, cryptography is a strong link, right? You can get provable results, you can know what's going to happen. But the thing that distinguishes cryptoeconomics is its reliance on game theory, right? Its reliance on we're going to make assumptions about how people are going to behave in their interests, and then we're going to be able to predict the behavior of the system and say this ledger is going to be reliable or something like that. And I'm here to be the dismal scientist, the economist, to make everybody upset. Because, and this is a place where the academic bias can really lead you astray, because if you look at the academic research into game theory, you'll see lots of results about the existence and uniqueness of a Nash equilibrium. That's what people like to publish, circumstances in which there exists a unique Nash equilibrium so that you can predict what goes on. But the bad news that you don't often hear is that those are very, very special and rare cases, and they rely upon usually a lot of assumptions. Assumptions like people's incentives are only within the system, we know what their payoffs are, and they're not coordinating with each other. And the games, this isn't a repeated game. It's a thing that is just happening once. It turns out there's something called the folk theory of game theory, the folk theorem in game theory, which is a very optimistic or pessimistic result depending on how you want to think about it, but it says that basically in repeated games, usually, the vast majority of the times, there is an infinite space of potential Nash equilibria, including some which are pretty bad for at least some of the participants. So the hazard of cryptoeconomics that I think this panel is really relevant to is that if you're relying upon payoffs within the system only, and you're going to let game theory be a piece of your cryptoeconomics, if you're going to try to make the case, like the Bitcoin blockchain tries to make the case, that we can predict that the right behavior is going to be everybody's going to do this thing and pick the longest blockchain and compete independently, you're wrong in a world where people can coordinate and it's a repeated game. The assumptions that you're making don't hold, and Vitalik's very, I think appropriately pessimistic view of the degree to which people can coordinate and that reduces the security is really on point. And I think all of this, even with proof of stake, this fundamental idea that if you're playing God with game theory, you're getting into trouble, because the God of game theory says people can do a wide variety of things, an infinite space of strategies most of the time. So in human systems, this is about identity and reputation. In human systems, we solve this problem with something that doesn't usually show up in payoff matrices, is that in human systems we can create infinite negative payoffs. We can exile people, shun people, let them no longer participate in the system. We can kill people, right? And in the real world, that's a lot of how we organize things so that people don't behave badly. We have things like prisons, and we don't usually put people into prisons, but they create really bad payoffs. And with an infinite negative payoff, you can get a lot more predictable behavior than you can with, say, a stake. And we can see this in the real world now when you look at what's wrong with the existing financial system. A lot of people notice it doesn't behave very well. It's very much gamed. And maybe if you wanted to create the incentives that would prevent that kind of gaming and attack, you could do it, but you'd have to put people into prison to do it, because just finding the firms is not going to do it. And so fundamentally, I think I'm going to disagree with Vlad Zemfir, who at the very beginning wonderfully framed the discipline and made it as a goal that we're going to try to get away from reputation and identity as being a means of organizing things. I'm going to sort of turn it around and say my view is that's going to turn out to be impossible and futile, and that a good cryptoeconomics is going to have to establish notions of identity, which is philosophically hard. Identity doesn't always necessarily mean one human is an identity. We have lots of different notions of identity, and they can be very consequential. The entire Eurozone crisis is a categorical mistake about identities. Right? It's not really, it's misidentified as a conflict between countries when it ought to be identified as a conflict between insiders and outsiders. Very consequential, even how you categorize identity. But fundamentally, the main point that I want to make is I don't think we're going to get any kind of successful cryptoeconomics until we establish means of there being strong identities and means of creating, this is very dismal, consequences that are effectively infinite, at least from the perspective of people who really desire to participate in the system, so that we can create walls and boundaries sufficient to get the kinds of results that we want about predictable behavior.
Quick point. I think Ed Felton has shown that Bitcoin does have infinitely many Nash equilibria.
On the one hand, I tend to agree with Steve that in the sense that like adding identity, particularly to crypto economic systems, can add efficiencies as well as add a degree of security that simply relying on economic incentives doesn't offer. At the same time, once you add in identity and these consequences based on what can happen to a particular identity for being a bad actor, the definition of what becomes bad is basically determined by the person with the power to levy the consequences. And right now, that power is obviously like massively on the side of a very concentrated group of individuals in the world right now. And so with this relying on pseudo anonymous systems is kind of a way of protecting the participants from just unilateral consequence levying by people who just define arbitrarily that what they're doing is bad. And so I think that's a balance that needs to be thought through, if we're actually going to consider adding strong identity to the consensus mechanisms and participation in these systems.
Yeah, I think so. To confirm, like I completely agree with what we said. I think that like we will nonetheless anyway always rely on like reputation and identity, and I think with the blockchain there is like the obvious way will basically be to just rely on our current identity and just to make sure that wherever there is like an intermediary or like an operator on the blockchain, that this person or this operator needs to know who is dealing it. And, like for instance, the exchange, you have to actually communicate your real identity, and then all the problems are resolved because you can finally again rely on like, ban them and whatever. The alternative is, and we were discussing this morning, is like, well, if you cannot oblige people to, enforce the real governmental identity, then you can try and infer it because, well, the blockchain is transparent, and then you can do analytics, and then you can try and like infer the identity of people by just looking at the different transactions, which I think is really dangerous because this is really just like analytics, this is just like statistic, and you have no idea of how this is actually the case or not, but you will still rely on it because that's all you have. And so and that's why I think like, so the work we're doing with Sabir, but this is just like one of many, I think it's really important to design another reputation system which doesn't, like many things you don't need to rely on identity itself as long as you have a system of like understanding who without really knowing the identity of who, but like the thing that you're interacting with, like how did they behave in the past, in the future, or, well, how they might behave in the future, and what is their contribution to the overall, so that it becomes actually costly to fake it. So of course you can never prevent completely that someone is going to fake the reputation, but the more costly you make it, then the more credible it becomes. And then if you can create a system that is sufficiently good that people actually rely on these instead of having to rely on the traditional governmental identity, then you can actually protect the system as a decentralized system.
That idea of adding a cost actually reminded me of what I was actually going to respond to your original question, which was, like how these reputation systems can be gained, like say in PageRank or something. And I think that, it's might be a rather naive suggestion, but if you just like add a cost to some reputation action, like whether it's an endorsement or something like that, then like could that possibly either slow down people who are trying to game it, or just at least limit their range of gaming?
Sure. I'll add something kind of tangential, just to say that I think one of the really interesting things about the blockchain is it's maybe reduced or put an appropriate API over identity. What I mean is that since the advent of the blockchain, it's become a lot easier to think about identity as more of like control of private keys. So now that we've kind of moved the complexity over to a problem that is sort of something that we need to solve more in general, you know, multi-signature wallets is one great way of dealing with that. But now that we've kind of reduced identity to the possession or proving that I have control over a set of private keys, and then I might have a whole set of blockchain addresses that have all these attributes or all these identity credentials about me, then I can use things like public key certificates to then prove that I have control over that address and thus that attribute is associated with me. So I think what's really fundamental about that is it's sort of shifted a lot of thoughts about identity away from sort of centralized user registry pyramidal structures, which you mentioned is sort of there's a gateway to that. When there's sort of a hierarchical structure controlling who can enter a community or who gets kicked out, then they essentially are levying the governance principles for that community. But if you can start from the ground up and use something, this sort of private key notion of identity, and use things like Sabir, you can start from the bottom up. So it's sort of an inverted pyramid, and I think these two systems can at least complement each other in the sense that we can create new systems that have the sort of governance mechanisms that communities want to sort of use to self-govern themselves.
And just on the cheating part, I think I would like to add something, which is the question is like, why do we actually need or care about an identity or a reputation system? I think there are multiple reasons, but one is because you actually want to know who you're interacting with, but the other one is and I think on the blockchain is the common case, is like you want to make sure that this person is not going to cheat you, right? So either you look at like the past behavior and you analyze, okay, this is a great person or not, but you still cannot measure, or you can use like, so for instance, you know, security deposit and things like this. And the nice thing about reputation is that they provide an alternative to like security deposit. So if I don't have enough money to make a collateral for my transaction, and then maybe no one is ever going to transact with me, I can actually build reputation, and then I can either like put my deposit at stake, or I can put my reputation at stake. You know, so it creates like alternative system. And if the reason why in the case in which we care about reputation because we want to make sure that a transaction will actually be performed as we decided, then I think it creates a nice alternative so that you can choose, you know, if you're happy to put your collaterals, you put it, but if you don't have the means, or because you don't want to, you can actually say, okay, I put my reputation at stake, and then you can take away my reputation if I don't actually comply.
So I think we're over, and we should probably just close on that. Does anyone have anything burning? All right.